Okay, this is a brief audio review of Doing Gender for Gender, Sex, and Society. Okay, so doing gender, what does that even mean, right? Gender, according to this reading, is a routine. It's a performance of our inner self and our inner sense of masculinity or femininity in a gender binary society. So doing gender involves a complex of socially guided perceptual, interactional, and micro-political activities. So what this really means is, in so many ways, we've taken for granted how society has labeled certain things as masculine and other things as feminine, and that we use that distinction to understand the world that we're in, right? So this affects how we perceive people, how we interact with each other, and of course, micro-political activities, meaning the kind of politics of individual and small social interactions. So another interesting thing that they bring up in the reading is this idea of gender as an accomplishment, meaning we learn to see it as something larger than our internal sense of gender, but the way we present ourselves to other gendered beings in society. So it's a situated doing, meaning we perform it around others who have a similar sense of what our performance means in regard to gender. So for instance, everything is gendered. The way we talk, the way we sit, like let's say you take a drink of a mug and you throw out your pinky, right? There's kind of different gendered perceptions about these things. Even the way, if you think about manspreading or that kind of idea, the way that you sit, women are socialized to take up less space. So they often learn to just kind of, physically take up less space out in public, especially. While men are often not socialized with those same notions. So there's different ways in which the kind of background noise of gender impacts so much of how we live and what we do. Okay, so when looking at perspectives on sex and gender, the accepted cultural perspective in the Western world is that, of gender basically views men and women as naturally defined categories instead of socially defined categories. And as they're seen as somehow connected to specifically biology, that means that they have different capabilities and personalities that are inherent, that come from different reproductive functions. Meaning hashtag all men this, hashtag all women that, right? That's kind of that, the accepted dominant, or what we call the hegemonic understandings of gender in society is it's inherently biological, it's opposites, right? We've talked about this before, this kind of idea of this or that in a binary. And that somehow like your personality is connected to what you got going on south of the border. Like that's an interesting way that we've kind of been socialized to believe this stuff. And so adult members of society really soak this up as truth. And so the differences become fundamental and enduring. Basically, people change themselves to be different and therefore create the difference that they're looking for. So there's a little bit of discussion in the chapter, in the reading about psychology versus sociology, as psychology is largely focused on sex role theories, that our current drives and motivations have roots in the evolutionary history, while sociology has long argued for a social constructionist approach to understanding gender. Right, so that it's not just biology, it's how we're raised, it's the culture, it's the value systems, it's these things. So role theory is another interesting one, and this is one of those things later on when you're like, what do you mean by theory? What theory am I supposed to apply in this class? Hint, role theory is one of them. Again, we're going to talk about a few of them through this lecture here. But basically, role theory sees roles in society as an outgrowth in biological differences. So it's kind of connecting back to that psychological or biological approach versus the idea of situated identities, that roles are situated and assumed that interacting with other social institutions creates those differences. So for instance, language itself is gendered, something that we talk about a lot in this class. So, for instance, the ways in which the second wave feminists tried to change some of the language is still impactful today, right? Like taking things and trying to make them more gender neutral, which apparently triggers everybody. But, terms, we've talked about this before, instead of saying policeman, having police officer. The idea is if you close your eyes and you think of the word police officer, you might still picture a man in your head, but officer does not have a specific gendered marker to it, meaning anyone of any gender could be a police officer, right? Or they did this with mailman to postal carrier, or things of that nature to kind of strip the word man that made it an exclusionary gendered position and replace it with something more neutral so that the gender distinction is not necessary, right? So meaning we know not just language is gendered, but also social roles and especially like jobs and career paths. And we know that they're gender marked because we often have to use the word to mark them. So if you say, oh, that person's a male nurse, why did you feel the need to say male nurse? Because you're gender marking the assumption that if you're a nurse, you're female. Or if you say, oh, she's a female pilot, right? Instead of saying she's a pilot, the idea again being that pilot means man. And so you have to say in a gender marked way female before it, right? So again, that's just kind of something that we'll continue to discuss in this class. Here's an actual excerpt from the reading. We argue that gender is not a set of traits, nor a variable, nor a role, but the product of social doings of some sort. Okay, moving on. Goffman's another one that they talked about a little bit in here, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later as well. Very important to the concept of performances. So when talking about doing gender or gender as a performance, Goffman's a very helpful theoretical aid there. So if you haven't heard of Goffman, you might not have been in a bunch of sociology classes. That's fine. Basically, he's one of these what they call symbolic interactionists, right? In sociology, there's three main paradigms, right? There's conflict theory or Marxism. You have functionalism, structural functionalism, and then you have symbolic interactionism. Those are the main three, right? So in symbolic interactionism, they say that you make meaning when you interact with other people. So Goffman's one of these folks, and he came up with this idea of dramaturgy, which basically just means that as we go through life, it's like we're performing a play to each other. So there's like, let's say, if you've ever performed a play, which I'm assuming you were forced to do as a child at some point, then you know that there's a script and that there's roles and there's lines assigned to each person, and there's also like a background and there's also like a subtext, things like that all go into the script itself and the performance itself. So Goffman kind of takes us all, we can go all down the rabbit hole with Goffman, but basically Goffman is saying that we basically prepare to perform for each other. So for instance, if my presentation of self that I'm trying to perform is professor, then there's some front stage and some backstage to professor. So front stage would be like doing this lecture right now, right? But the backstage that you don't see is me preparing for the lecture, or making the slides, or making the notes, or getting multiple degrees in sociology, or things like that. The background preparation that goes into the performance of a particular role. Just as an actor would practice their lines over and over, or things like that, we do that as well before we perform for other people. So Goffman talks about expressions given off or expressed, that we intentionally give off messages as well as unintentionally. And our gender performance is no different when it comes to this. So, the gendered expressions that we have might reveal clues to the underlying fundamental dimensions of, kind of gender in our society. But Goffman really sees this as optional. He's saying that we are choosing to perform these things in our daily interactions, right? So basically, to Goffman, it's a choice, right? It's how we perform is really something that we're putting work into crafting a particular sense of ourselves that we're trying to portray to others. He also talks about it in this context of what he calls impression management. They don't really get into that in the reading, but just for fun, which is basically that you want people to see the best version of you. So you're going to kind of tailor your approach to that. So kind of a dumb example I could give. I've been broke most of my life. And there's been a couple times where I needed to not look broke, right? Going to court, you're trying to get a job interview, or things like that. But also sometimes just going to like a nice event, like a wedding or something like that. And I don't know if you've heard of it. There's this site or app or whatever the crap you can call it, called Rent the Runway, which I've used on more than one occasion, where you basically like rent a dress it ranges anywhere from like 40 to $100, which is still unfortunately cheaper than buying a nice dress often. You can rent the dress for like $40. That's like a really nice dress that I would never be able to afford, and then just return it the next day. You can rent the jewelry too, which highly recommend. Highly recommend. But anyway, I've had those situations where you have to do that. So if you think about the performance there, you basically are getting these props, as in the fancy clothes or the whatever. You know, if you're going into a job interview, you're putting on like a blazer when you don't normally wear blazers, right? Because you want to convey a certain image about you. You want them to think, oh, this person at the job interview, wow, look at that blazer. They must be really professional, right? Or, wow, look at that really nice dress that she's wearing. She must not be incredibly broke, which she clearly is if you look at everything else. But anyways, so that idea of presentation itself is that we want to show a certain thing about ourselves. And sometimes some of this stuff is unintentional to us because we've just been socialized to do it. So in a way, gender can become part of that performance. We don't realize it because we've had those microaggressions from people around us our entire lives that tell us to like sit like a lady or be a man. And those things can then subtly influence our performances. Okay, moving on to Garfinkel's case study of Agnes, which is an interesting one in the reading. So this was basically, the case study was first used to show that gender is created through interaction at the same time that structures interaction. So Agnes did not have the socially agreed upon biological criteria for classification as a member of the female sex. But in daily life, we don't see sex, we see gender. Right? We operate from an assumption that those who dress as men are men, and those who dress as women are women. Like, when it comes to sex categorization, we take appearance at face value unless we have a reason to doubt that. So Agnes, in the case study, used her outward feminine appearance as a resource on the cultural acceptance of her being female. And when it comes to gender, Agnes thought she could protect herself if she was overtly feminine. She used the critiques of her fiancé that he had of other women and their incorrect gender performances to learn what was expected of women by men. And, oh, did I put it on here? Yes, I did. Okay. I don't know if I put that on the slide or not. When it comes to gender and accountability, members of society regularly engage in what's called in the reading descriptive accounts of affairs to one another. This just means a person engaged in virtually any activity can be held accountable for the performance of that activity as a woman or a man, and their belonging to one category or the other in a binary can be used to legitimate or discredit their other activities. So it's this idea of someone's challenging a gender performance, it kind of challenges everything about a person. Meaning oftentimes gender performance can also be a challenge of sex. It can be a challenge of sexual orientation, right? That we kind of assume these things are fully connected when they are distinct categories. Okay, moving on to resources for doing gender. So doing gender means creating differences between girls and boys, women and men, differences that are not natural, essential, or biological. So what the hell does that mean? Well, Goffman uses sports as an example here, right? For these standardized social occasions as one of these examples, that as an institutionalized framework for the expression of manliness, right? So it's really interesting when women inhabit these roles that are considered pathways to prove masculinity. It's kind of genderedly problematic for us. Like, so for instance, if you think about, female bodybuilders who, to be successful as a bodybuilder, you have to be like the biggest and the most ripped you can possibly be. But to be big and ripped is to fail as a woman, right? So if you're a female bodybuilder, you have to have this weird situation where you want to get as big and muscular as possible because that's winning at your sport. Yet at the same time, you have to balance that with some femininity. And you've seen this with other high-profile female athletes that are muscular. This idea that muscularity is masculine, and therefore they often feel that they have to be hyper-feminine in their makeup, fake eyelashes, their hair, their little outfits have to be cute, like those kind of things to somehow push back on the idea that it's an expression of manliness. So the idea, like if you're lifting weights and you're strong, that we have to look through that in a binary through a gendered lens instead of just saying like, wow, that person's strong. Like who cares what their gender is, right? Wow, they can really lift a lot of weight. It becomes more a measure of, well, if that's so masculine, then something's wrong with her for being able to do that at all, because only men should be able to do that. So, it's a really interesting situation versus, men, if they're bodybuilders, they would never think, well, I can't get too muscular or then people won't think I'm a man, right? So again, but that's something that, a female bodybuilder would have to worry about just because of the kind of assumptions about gender in society. So, another thing was the assorted mating practices among heterosexual couples also gives us more opportunity to create and maintain differences between men and women. So think about the kind of, like, with Valentine's Day upon us, think about the kind of, other things like Valentine's Day that are very heteronormative and promote this idea that there's, very clear sex or gender distinctions. So for instance, who asks whom out on a date? Well, we think of it within a heteronormative context, and we think, well, men should ask women on dates. And, again, a lot of that comes from the economic history of society, which we'll talk about later. But anyway, so what's interesting, though, is that we create and maintain the differences. So if there's an idea that men smell a certain way, they wear cologne, right? They grow out their facial hair. Let's not pretend women don't have facial hair, right? Or that women don't have leg hair or arm hair or other hair, right? They do. They just often go through electrolysis, shaving, waxing, etc. to create the difference. I mean, not to mention, of course, a lot of men do a lot of this manscaping kind of stuff today, too. It's very strange for me because I'm old and I grew up in a very Tom Selleck era where, like, dudes had, like, chest hair. So it's kind of weird to me now when they don't because I'm like, what's wrong? What happened to you? But anyway, that just, again, shows my own gender notions, how these things change over time. So even the notion of what is masculine has changed quite a bit. So we're creating and maintaining differences by hyper-performing for each other. So again, this can mean, the nails, the hair, the makeup, the everything that women often do, that obviously it's not natural to have red lips or, blue, eyeshadow or things like this, but they're fun. They're pretty. It's something that, as a performative thing, can be actually quite enjoyable regardless of your gender. It can be kind of nice to play with these things, right? But where it comes into this context is that it becomes routinized. It becomes something you have to do. It's not a choice that you're making because it's fun. It's something that you're expected to do. And when you don't do it, people are like, oh, are you okay? Are you sick? Is there something wrong? Right? So we create these differences. And then we basically maintain through our interactions with each other those differences. So this does not allow for the expression of natural differences, but the production of difference itself. In a similar way as the habitus argument, the role becomes the fact and the performance becomes the evidence of difference. Right? So, for instance, let's say you are a little girl and you're told that, sweating is gross and for boys, and that, you don't want to be too muscular, and that, you want to be thin but not bulky, etc., then how does that impact your physical fitness? How does that impact your likelihood of getting dirty, of becoming very muscular, of things like that, right? For a lot of little girls, they would internalize that notion and then actually become physically weaker, not work out, not, if they're going to work out, it's going to be smaller, not to be stronger often, right? So again, some of this is changing in society, and thank God for that. But in a lot of ways, this is still very, very prevalent. Our societal norms reduce us to the inevitability of gender performance differences because the idea of essentialism is, if it comes from nature and we challenge it, are we not just going against nature, right? But in reality, we're not going against nature. right? There's nothing in nature that says you have to have longer eyelashes if you're a girl, right? In reality, we're going against social norms that make societal values just seem like nature to us. So role conflict can be viewed as the dynamic aspect of our current system of gender. We experience role conflict when we perform outside of the expectations for our gender. Okay, so I did put it on the slide there. Okay. All right, research agendas. Okay, so the conventional approach to the process of becoming a girl, becoming a boy, right, again, in a binary system, has been sex role socialization. In recent years, research has looked into how these classification structures so much of our identities. So if you look at gender and the division of labor as an example, being male or being female in a binary society has mattered historically in a capitalist society when it comes to allocation and inheritance. Due to the patriarchal nature of our society, for many years women could not inherit wealth. It was passed down to their sons. I mean, when you really look at it, it's a complicated history with it because there's like the national laws versus the state laws. Some states allowed for this, and that, blah, blah, blah. But basically, overall, in many patriarchal ways, there were kind of limitations through capitalism on how women could actually control money, have any economic freedom, or, there's a time in which women could not even own intellectual property, let alone property. So that's why they couldn't even like publish a book with their name on it, because you're like, no, you can't even own your own thoughts, which is nuts. So as we determine what a person does in society, gender is central to our understandings. We have a notion of women's work. We have a notion of men's work instead of just work. So we're going to discuss that way more in detail later on. Okay, sex and sexuality. So the understandings we have of heterosexuality are clearly linked to our assumptions and notions about gender in a binary. So in the same way we accept certain roles and expectations for certain genders, we also have accepted performance of sexuality that is very gendered. Again, who initiates sex? Who asks who out at a date? Who pursues? This idea that in a heterosexual notion that men are aggressive and women are passive, that only men have a sexual orientation or sexual desire or drive. This is cultural stuff. Like, this is not biology at all. So the real question becomes, can we avoid doing gender? Is it unavoidable because of the social consequence of not being part of either acceptable group in a binary society? Well, I mean, we already know the answer to this, right? Of course you can avoid it. In some ways, there's plenty of people who are gender fluid, gender non-binary, or push back against these categories in the ways in which they actually live their gendered lives. So this sex category gender relationship links the institutional and interactional levels, and it legitimizes sexual arrangements based on sex categories and reproduces expectations through interactions. So basically, gender becomes a built-in mechanism of social control. There are some of us that realize, hey, this is happening and, I can push back against this. But we also know that there's big consequences for those who do, right? Meaning it's not as if someone is non-binary and everyone's like, cool, I totally accept that and support that, right? There's often social costs to being who you are in that way, or rejecting these binary ideas. So social change must be pursued at the cultural and institutional levels. Gender is a powerful ideological device that produces, reproduces, and legitimates the choices and limits that are predicated on sex categories. So again, can we change this? Yes. We are doing it every day in how we perform, because again, sometimes these changes are subtle, sometimes these changes are larger and happen quicker in society. And we're going to talk about this, especially we have like a whole chapter on social change we'll talk about later, of the ways in which it has changed and the ways in which it hasn't changed enough. Okay, that's all for today.